So Emmanuel, he is a Ghanaian-born doctoral student in African history and a graduate teaching assistant at Michigan State University. He has research interests in colonial transport infrastructure, labor mobility, power and gender in West Africa. He is also interested in Atlantic history and has taken undergraduate and graduate courses in slavery in Africa and across the Atlantic, including the Atlantic slave trade that took Africans from their homelands to the Americas. And his PhD dissertation would examine how colonial railway, road, and harbor construction and development in the Gold Coast, which is currently known as Ghana, occasioned migration of wage labor, permanent settlements, labor politics, Pan-Africanism, and the construction of gender and domestic life from the later part of the 19th century to the first half of the 20th century. Now, before he pursued his PhD, he received his Bachelor's of Arts in Social Science Education in History and in Economics from the University of Ghana, University of Education, Winneba, Ghana, and his Master's of Philosophy in History from the University of Cape Coast, Ghana. He also served as a teaching and research assistant at the Department of History Education at the University of Education, Ghana. I'm saying all this to say that he is an expert and we should hear him out. So we are happy to have you here, Mr.
Quite
Emmanuel.
Impressive, my goodness.
Yes, so please go ahead, and if I missed anything, introduce yourself to us, and I will have you just jump in my first question, which is what inspired you to pursue history and slavery in the first place?
Okay, thank you, Naomi. Thank you, everyone, for being part of this. When Naomi told me about this, I was so happy because I've always purposed coming into a program like history from the undergraduate level. I have decided to speak with people who are interested in the histories of Africa. And I'm very happy to talk about this slavery, specifically Atlantic slave trade, which also moved people from Africa to the Americas. So I'm happy to speak with you, and I'm willing to answer all the questions that I am knowledgeable about to be able to provide insight into what we've not been told when it comes to this Atlantic slavery. I think Naomi said it all. I think in the meantime, you said everything about me. So, but to say it again, I'm currently a doctoral student in African history at Michigan State University. So currently, I am at East Lansing. I don't know if anyone knows here in Michigan.
Yes, I'm actually in Michigan too.
Yeah, sure. Have you ever been to East Lansing?
I have not, but
okay.
Yeah, I have heard of Lansing, yeah.
Okay, yeah, nice.
So what inspired you to study history and slavery? What got you there?
Yeah, I mean, in tracing what motivated me to do African history, and I'm very interested in African history, but African history intersects with other kinds of histories. And so if you're doing African history, you tend to read other histories like Black studies in the US or Black history in the US. And I am currently doing it as a secondary area in my program. Going back, I think I started when I was in high school. And where I had my high school education happened to have some kind of slave site that was used in the past to keep slaves that came from the interior of Ghana until they were transported to the coast where the British, the Dutch, and the Portuguese had their castles and forts. And so going through that and having the experiences of how people went through this traumatic experience, I was inspired to say, okay, it is important that Africans tell their own history. And so going to college, I decided to do African history, specifically to be able to help in contributing to the historiography of African history. And so the motivation came from there. I was shaped by the fact that I visited these slave sites, and anyone who goes to Ghana would have that opportunity to go to Asemans, where I had my senior high school, which has the river of last bath for the slaves until they get to the Americas or their destinations in the Americas. So that shaped me. Going through my undergraduate and master's degree programs, I've had some kind of experience, and some of these experiences are sometimes traumatic, especially when you talk about or when you think about the violence that people went through, not only slavery, but then other part of an aspect of events, specifically colonialism and other events. It's so traumatic. But like I said early on, I am happy telling some of these stories, and I'm going to be very objective as much as possible to be able to unravel some of these things. So the motivation came from my high school days.
Okay, wonderful. I remember growing up in Ghana in high school, we did visit some of the slave sites too, but it never registered to me until I moved here. Like you go and they say, you know, there were slaves and they were shipped off, but it just, I didn't understand what they were trying to say until I moved here. And I realized, wait, what they actually meant was they really did take people. So that takes me to my question, why did slavery happen in the first place? What motivated that whole trade?
Okay, I mean, going through these questions and hearing some of the questions, I think I am very happy because for us to understand the kinds of slavery and slave trade that existed in Africa, it is important that we understand how it all began. So back in Africa, in the past, specifically before the arrival of European merchants who were perceived to be merchants, Africans had some kind of institutions. And as part of the institutions, there was some kind of servitude. And so people who were rich or wealthy basically got people to serve them. And that was some kind of mild kind of servitude where people were acquired to serve them. Over time, this translated into some kind of slavery with its dynamics, but this kind of slavery was not so much like what happened during the Atlantic slave trade. Here, slaves had their rights. Some of them were obtained through various reasons, through wars, among others. And so the dynamics in the African type of slavery were different if you compare it to the global one. And so people got some of these slaves to work for them, basically. Some of them got them to work on their farms, in their homes, as servants and all that. And so it was some kind of institution that existed.
And this was before the Europeans arrived.
Yeah, before the Europeans arrived.
Was this across was this across Africa or just Ghana? Like this sort of
Africa.
The whole Africa. Okay.
It was across Africa, but it was contextual, depending on the nature of that servitude. But then it was an institution that helped the society to thrive in terms of getting laborers to work and all that. But then one thing about it is that people with time leveraged the opportunity to abuse some human rights in there. But when the Europeans arrived, especially in the 1400s, in Ghana, or I would say Elmina specifically, the Portuguese were the first people to arrive. And then when they arrived, they decided to trade in normal goods like natural resources, like gold, ivory, among others. And it's one of the reasons they named Ghana previously the Gold Coast, because of the abundance of gold in there. But then with time, they decided that they wanted some kind of labor where after they had occupied places like the Americas and other places, they needed some kind of labor to be able to enhance or facilitate their occupation. And so in doing that, they tried all aspects and then began contacting Africans because already they had had contact with Africans. And so going back to Africa, especially in the at the beginning of the 1500s, was a key thing for them to get the people because they had believed that Africans could withstand the pressure in the Americas to be able to work for them. So they wanted efficiency. Because of this efficiency, Africans became the thing. And when it began, at some point, you see that some African leaders were coerced into selling human beings to these people. And they also brought a lot of European goods where Africans also began to be interested in and acquiring them. And so the interest in getting these goods also was a way for them to also sell them. But then in some instances, I'll give some specific instances where people were coerced. And at the same time, Africans also resisted the kind of slavery that existed within the period. So to go back to what I've said and to just to summarize the whole thing, I would say that one, it was an institution in Africa where it was some kind of servitude. People used laborers or slaves to say enslaved people at the time for their own work, either domestic or commercial work. But then with time, with the coming of the Atlantic slave trade, the whole thing changed where there were people serving as merchants going into selling them for work in the Americas, basically working on plantations in the Americas.
Okay, so there was already slavery before the Europeans arrived.
Yeah, but that kind of slavery was different.
It was different. Now,
very different.
let me ask you this, because as you're saying it, I'm looking at the current Ghana where when you look at the kingdoms, when they're kings and stuff, they still have people that serve them, right? Current day Ghana, we have kings and they have their servants. Would that be considered slavery then?
Currently?
Yes.
So currently, I won't say that would be slavery. I mean, Ghana is a republican state, and for what I have come to understand, it is unusual for a republican state to have kingdoms. And so currently, we don't have any kingdom in Ghana. We just have chiefs who are still under the constitution, and they basically are being over-empowered by the president. And so people who served in chieftaincy or places we would term as palaces and all that are not seen currently as slaves. Because one, if you want to define slavery or who a slave is, there are some kind of element and characteristics that you have. And these people currently serving there basically do that
by choice.
By choice. And they have their normal jobs.
Yes,
so
they do.
They just volunteer to basically serve.
I wanted to understand. I wanted to understand the magnitude of the slavery there at that time, because when you're saying there used to be a servitude system, you also said it wasn't as intense as the British. So I wanted to understand, compare the two, but okay, I get it now.
Very different.
As you were talking, you said African leaders were coerced, and also there were exchange of goods that the British the Europeans were bringing, and so that enticed some of the African leaders to get involved or sell people, trade people. What when you say coerced, were they forced or what was so they were forced?
I can explain some of these things, and I'll give some
explain that part, because we really want to know what role did the African leaders play into that.
So like I said the other time to you, I'm going to be very contextual when it comes to, I'll give examples of places where the interplay of power and Christian, I would say, values and power also played a key role in this kind of coercion and this kind of control, setting up a lot of strategies to be able to get people to sell slaves to them. And so specifically, when it comes to the question, you see that if you go through history, you see that with the coming of the Europeans, there were some kinds of institutions set up by these Europeans. So you can talk about the Portuguese being the first to come to Ghana, for example. The Dutch also followed. The British came. The Danish people also came, and other people. In other part of Africa, you see the French. You see other European nations also coming in to transport people. And normally when we talk about slavery, we focus much more on probably West Central Africa, but then in the eastern part of Africa, the Arabs were also engaged in securing people across the other side through to the northern part of Africa, to wherever they wanted to use them. And so, for example, there was a place known as the Congo. So the Congo, I wouldn't say present day. So it's part of present day Congo, Brazzaville, and the other Congo. So the Congo was a very strong kingdom, and even it merged before the Asante Kingdom. So the Portuguese were the first who have traded with them in terms of slaves. So when the Portuguese occupied the place, they made sure that they have very good relationship with the kings at the time. That was very strategic for them to get the minds of the people to be able to get whatever they wanted. So in getting that, they took hold of the government and even set up some kind of Portuguese government, which had its power from Portugal, Lisbon. And in doing that, they put in some kind of measures like ordinances, strategies to be able to compel the kings in a way to sell people to them. So that was one of the ways. Some kind of, if you have some kind of relationship in terms of diplomatic relationship or any other thing, there were laws or ordinances that ensured that you own them some kind of slaves. So that was one of the ways that people were coerced. And when it comes to the chiefs and the kings at the time, the Congo was a clear example. The period between the 1500s through to the 1800s, a lot of Congolese were exported as slaves, and they were just transported to different part of the Americas, northern and southern part. And a key point, you can find a lot of them in South Carolina. And these people were engaged in the plantation economy. And so that was one of the ways. Another way was also to use the church. And that is when the church is complicit when it comes to the issue of slavery and slave trade. So what they used was that, at the time, Portugal had a clear relationship with the Catholic Church, even though it had the Vatican in Italy. There was some clear connection where the Portuguese states and the Catholic Church worked hand in hand. So I would say they were in bed in terms of getting these slaves. And what they did was to come to Africa. Example, you can see the Congo, you can see Angola, you can see the Gold Coast, you can see a part of Nigeria where the Catholic Church ensured that in converting the people into the Christian kind of religion, he also compelled them to understand that they were at some point in life there should be slaves, and slavery is even accepted in the Bible for them to understand. So if you're seen as a slave, then the Bible even says it, and it should be fine with them. So they converted them and controlled their minds to understand that slavery wasn't bad. And so if you sold into slavery, then you should be able to obey your master in quotes. So the master is in quotes. And there are clear examples where Africans were converted into Christianity. They trained them to be, I would say, missionaries. And these missionaries who were Africans also were made to defend the institution of slavery. And I'll give you an example of one in the Gold Coast around the 1700s. The name was Jacobin. And this one was within the Catholic Church. He was enslaved. He was a native of Cape Coast in Ghana, present-day Ghana. What they did was to convert him into Christianity, trained him. Even before he was trained, he was enslaved. And so the British got him and he was just trained into being a missionary. And then he came back to defend the idea of the institution, so that if my fellow Ghanaian is defending the idea of the institution, then it means that it is good, right? So in order to get them, the church was also complicit in ensuring that they controlled the minds of the people to ensure that. And this was some kind of coercion, because your failure to, there's a law, there were laws, there were ordinances. Your failure to obey the ordinance and all that will mean there will be punishment. And these Europeans had superior weapons. At some point, there will be slave raidings. So there were instances where slave raiding and all that, they use this complex, sophisticated weapons to control some of them. So then they had no choice to obey some of these laws.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
So while what I'm hearing you say is, while a lot of these African leaders did sell their people,
yeah,
they were sort of brainwashed.
Yes.
Through Christianity, the Christian values, to think that slavery was okay, that it was God's part of God's plan. And so while it was bad and malicious, like, why would you sell your people? In a way, they were brainwashed.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, Ms. Kim asked, she said, was there a price that slaves could pay for freedom? And if so, what was the price?
So when this whole thing began, I mean, it is also contextual, because within the African kind of slavery, people served for various purposes. Sometimes parents will be in debt, and in order to pay the debt, sometimes they have to offer some of the children to go and serve for a period of time. So when those kind of years are over, the children get their freedom. But then the dynamics changed with the coming of the Atlantic slave trade, especially in the 1500s. Those who were enslaved were basically sold. And so in Africa, some were prisoners as well, where they were not transported. They were just being kept to be later to be sold. But then if you are a descendant of a slave, probably if your mother or your father is a slave in Africa, and you'd want some kind of freedom, the terms differ. It will mean that you can pay off to be able to be free. Paying off will mean maybe in terms of working for that owner for a specific period of time, or probably you have that amount of money. At the time, there were different kinds of mediums of payment. And if, like, for example, people use gold to pay off debts. So if you're able to pay that, then you become free. But then the issue of freedom with the coming of the Atlantic slave trade wasn't so common, because a lot of people captured and sold were transported to other part of Africa. And so then it comes to the idea of what happened in the Americas in terms of you want your freedom. I mean, that is also contextual, because when you come to the northern part of the Americas, you understand that there were laws and legislation for people to work so hard to be able to enhance colonial occupation in the Americas. But then in some cases, there were manumission laws. And where in manumission, it will get to a point where the laws specify the kind of things you needed to do to be able to get your freedom. And so answering this question, it is contextual. We look at the case in Africa where at some point, some places will demand that you pay off. At some point, you can't pay off, you'll be transported, you'll be sold and transported to the Americas. And then in the Americas, there were issues with getting your freedom. Freedom and all that became very clear, especially in the 1800s, when slavery and the slave trade was going towards dying, in terms of they saw that it wasn't attractive anymore and it was inhumane. So, for example, the British, discovering that they needed some kind of natural resources and wanted some kind of colonialism, they decided to fight against slavery, so that people will end slavery and then go into or transition into legitimate kind of trade. That is the colonial period. And so during the period in the US, you see a lot of freedom people, abolition began in the 1700s through, you can see Douglas and other people asking that slaves be freed because they've seen it as inhumane and all that. And laws were done to ensure that slaves were freed in the US or in the Americas. Even with that, people still there was some kind of internal slavery within the Americas, where people either moved from the northern part to the southern part, because deep south, you understand that there were a lot of slave plantations or plantations basically that had slaves working on them. And so, like I said, it is contextual, and what matters here is place and time. So when you look at the time, you understand that, oh, this time probably wasn't possible for someone to get their freedom. At this place, maybe it was possible for people to maybe pay off and then get their freedom.
Okay, so before the Europeans arrived in Africa to do slavery, there was the African slavery. And then if you wanted to pay the price, if you were slaves and you wanted to pay the price, or if you owed, because you said people became slaves based on debt and other reasons. So let's say there was a debt and they wanted to pay their way, they would send, let's say, their kids to go work, and then they get their freedom after they paid off. Now, when the Europeans came, it was mostly if you could afford whatever price tag it was, gold or whatever, and if you couldn't afford it, they would sell you to the Americas. Is that what I mean?
So what happened in terms of selling people, basically, with the Atlantic slave trade, freedom wasn't so common.
It wasn't a choice. Okay. So the choice part was during the Africans doing their own slavery. Okay. All right. And then, so when the slave trade happened and people are being sold to the Americas, and then it transitioned into colonialism, where slavery ended, but they still wanted to find a way to control the African continent or use their natural resources. So they say, this isn't humane, so let's try and do this pretty thing and act as if we are saviors. But in other words, we're still doing the same thing or taking advantage of them. Okay. Okay. Are there any African societies or leaders that fought against, you said they were, some of them were coerced and brainwashed, but were there some people that stood their ground and said no and fought? And if there were, can you give us examples, and how are they being honored in this day?
So that is a very good question. Sometimes I think about how we need to make our public history available to people to understand the past, especially past of violence, when it comes to telling our history. So in terms of resistance, I would tie it to basically Africa and then the Americas. So I would talk about resistance in Africa during the period and mention some of the places that resisted, and some people, specifically people who resisted, and give you some of the places or some of the things that you can look up for on the internet, or basically places or on libraries where you can read and understand some of these. I think we have to pay attention to some of these people because they did very well. And interestingly, some of them were queens, women, basically. So I am very interested. So in Africa, even though some kings, not only kings, but also merchants, some people became merchants, went into the interiors of the African continent, specifically if you go to Ghana, or the Gold Coast at the time, you see that people moving from the coast would go into the interior, like Kumasi and other places, and then up north to get slaves and then bring them through that route. And they walked during that period. There were no system of transportation at the time, so they walked up north down to the southern part of the coast. And so there were merchants basically who engaged in that. When it comes to the coercion and all this kind of raiding, and they use different forms. So your ability to resist and defend yourself will mean that you survive. If you're unable to resist, then it means that you'll be sold. So imagine those who are unable to do that, it means you'll be sold. If you don't have that strength, if you don't have the ammunition or the weapon to defend yourself, then it becomes very difficult. In going through all these periods, you'd understand that a lot of people were not happy about what was happening. So people came together to resist in various forms. But then some states and kingdoms also resisted. So, for example, when you look at the issue of Angola, so Angola is basically, we can find in the west central part of Africa. And it goes back to the period even before slavery. So you can find Angola in the 11th century, 12th century, and all that. But then when it got within the 1400s, that is basically the 15th century, with the coming of the Portuguese, here again, the Portuguese again, they are here again. What happened was that they took control of Angola and took control of the state, and coerced the chiefs and the kings in selling and procuring slaves. And in doing that, some people were not happy about it. So one example is Queen Njinga. So Queen Njinga was the daughter of the king at the time, and this period was around the 1600s through to the 1700s. Queen Njinga succeeded, ascended the throne after the father's death, and the father, even before the father's death, they had decided that they were not going to sell slaves to the Portuguese, but the Portuguese were coercing them, and then were making sure that they sold slaves to them. So Queen Njinga becoming the queen of Ndola. At the time, it was called Ndola, the Ndola kingdom, but then presently you can see it as the northern part of Angola. So what happened was that she, being the queen and having the ability, was able to resist all forms of slavery and ensure that Ndola at the time, or Angola presently, was basically independent and free from all kinds of slavery. And this was rare. It happened between 1622 and 1663. So this was the clear period. And so Njinga was one of the people, and she was a woman who basically resisted with her state as a queen, resisted Portuguese invasion and procuring of slaves in Angola.
Wow.
If you, there's even a movie on that, but movies are sometimes fictional, and so they add a lot of things and take a lot of sometimes.
What's the name of that movie?
Queen Njinga.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So what about because in Ghana we learn about Yasantua, Queen Mother Yasantua.
Yeah.
Can you touch on that too?
Okay, so Yasantua's period wasn't a period of slavery. Her period was basically colonial period. And that was the latter part of the 19th century. That was around 1898 or so. And the resistance by Yasantua and the other chiefs happened, I think, was in the aftermath that Asante was basically colonized, and it became part of the Gold Coast. Because when you talk about the Gold Coast during the colonial period, was only within the southern part of Ghana. Asante and the northern part were not part of the whole thing. So what happened was that, but this is also a different context, was within the colonial period. So what happened was that at the end of slavery, by the second half of the 1800s, so basically from 1850s, 60s through to the end of the century, the European, basically in Ghana, the British had taken control of the place, and they were the colonial authorities. I don't call them masters because I don't see them as masters. I call them authorities. Yeah, they had authority. They had some legislations and all that, and were able to exert their control over the people. So what happened was that At the turn of the 20th century, so beginning of the 1900s, so 1901, 1902, the British wanted to go into the interior to get the gold, to get the mineral resources and all the natural resources. And in getting that, they needed to control the land. But the Asante people were resisting. So there had been series of Anglo-Asante war even before this period. And it started long before the 1900s. And so I think the issue of the Asante War was basically the fifth or sixth time the Asante had fought with the British. So what happened was that King Prempeh at the time had been exiled by the British. He was the king of the Asante people. And because he had been exiled and had been sent to Seychelles, there was some kind of vacancy and some kind of vacuum created for someone to take charge of the Asante people. And so when the Asante came again, and they wanted, it was told, the story is told that they wanted to take the golden stool. The golden stool was the soul of the Asante kingdom. And according to legend, if it is taken away, then it means that the Asante kingdom is not going to exist anymore. And so the people decided to protect the whole thing. So Yasantua being part of, she was the queen of the Jews, so not basically Kumasi, but just a different, a similar within the Asante enclave, which was part of the kingdom at the time, decided to team up with other people to resist the invasion and the control of the golden stool. And so she did that, even though she was defeated, the people were defeated, they resisted, and the British were not able to take the golden stool away. So that is the story about Yasantua coming into play.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you for touching on that. We are actually going to Ghana in November, and in part of majority of our, when it comes to the culture, we will be going to Kumasi to learn about the Ashanti culture and learn about Yasantua. We'll be going to our museum and things like that. So I wanted, I'm glad to know, understand more that it was actually not the slavery time, but the colonial time.
Yeah, it was
but
colonial
the story, her story is very empowering because
while
all the men were chickening out, she said, no, we're going to fight. So she gathered her own army. Was this army that she gathered all women, or was it a mix?
So it was a mix. According to, people didn't document a lot of these things. And so normally when you hear some of these stories, it's just oral sources. According to what I've heard from elderly people, it was a mixture of men and women. But the point here is that to put women as agents of their own kind of history and development, it's important to appreciate the fact that she was a woman leader who was able to control the army to resist the British taking the golden stool away. But I would also want to touch on, after we are done with Yasan, I want to touch on the kinds of resistance in the Americas when Black Africans were transported there, because there are interesting stories that also talk about the idea of Africans putting their own agency and contesting the injustices of slavery in the Americas.
Yeah, you can go into it. So you're saying one day when Africans were transported into the Americas, what are some of the resistance that happened?
Yeah, some of them resisted, and I was so surprised a couple of years ago to hear and to read about some kind of popular revolt in the Americas and in the Caribbean. So specifically between 1760 and 1761, there was this revolt in Jamaica. A lot of Ghanaians were sent to Jamaica. And so when you go to Jamaica, there are a lot of Ghanaian communities because of this Atlantic slave trade. And so most of these people were from the coast, so Cromante, Briwa, and those areas. So there was a revolt between, like I mentioned, 1760 and 61. There was a revolt known as the Turkey's Revolt. It was done by a man called Taki from Cromante in the central part of Ghana. And what happened was that he organized the people who understood the Ghanaian language, specifically Fanti language, organized them and stood up against the injustice of slavery and killed a lot of European authorities at the time. Eventually, he was captured and beheaded. But then this went a long way for people to understand that Africans were not passive in this kind of Atlantic history. They became agents in terms of making sure that they resisted. And that people also resisted using their spirituality. And I'll give you an example of someone known as Dominguez, who came from Dahomey. Dahomey is in the western part of Ghana, western part of Africa, currently. What he did was that, during the time, Africans were very spiritual. Africans had their way of healing, orthodox kind of healing, orthodox kind of spirituality to communicate with God. And so this one, known as Dominguez from Dahomey, was knowledgeable in terms of healing. So what happened was that even though he was sold as a slave, and was used within the period, he used his ability to heal people to contest his condition. So what happened is that in order to seek freedom, so that is also, it's also one of the ways that we can talk about people purchasing their freedom. He ensured that he used herbs to heal slaves. So masters will bring their slaves. Some slaves went through some kind of disease and all that. So he was able to heal them with this kind of skill. And it was very spiritual. We would have to combine some kind of herbs and other spiritual kind of things to be able to do some of these things. And he was able to go through this. And he inserted his agency within that to ensure that he was free. He moved from one place to the other. And he came from the western part of Africa. It was called Dominguez. So that was another way of resisting. Even quitting as a slave was also a form of resistance. So people would say, I'm no more a slave. And if you watch the movie Kunta Kinte talks about the transportation of Africans from the Gambia to the Americas, where Kunta Kinte, going through the period, basically for you to lose your identity, when you go to the Americas, the masters will change your name and give you English and European names. Kunta Kinte decided to resist the idea of being named as European or probably American or whatever name. He decided to resist the renaming and was able to maintain his name as Kunta Kinte. And that was also another form of resistance. And his descendants were also able to go through this process and able to maintain their name, and it ran through the generation. Another form was another revolt was, I think, in 1733, and that was within St. John. I think St. John in Virginia currently also. It was also another form of resistance, and it was also done by Ghanaians. In the same way, Ghanaians also formed some kind of community with their traditional music, traditional values, to also bring together people to form some kind of community. And in forming that kind of community was also a way to resist some kind of foreign influence in that. And a popular kind of culture in that is called the Nawa. So the Nawa is spelled like Gnawa. It was some kind of culture where you'd have some kind of African music, African kind of food, traditions, even marriages and all that, so that they would understand that even though they were in bondage, they still were able to maintain their cultures. That is the idea of retention within slavery. And I appreciate some of these things because going through all this trauma and injustices and being able to maintain your culture and your identity is a big deal and something that we should celebrate. There were other places we can also mention. There's another one known as Equia from Asante, who also was sober. Who was also
Here's my name. That's why I got so excited. Yeah.
And later on, I'll give you some website, one that we have here, which basically chronicles some interesting stories about some of these slaves and revolts and all that. It is also a way for people to heal going through some of these things. And it is, you can put it down, enslaved.org. You can just search it on the internet. It will send you to that website for you to see what happened. And so, yeah, in Africa and in the Americas, there were resistance, and this resistance were Africans who were not happy about what was happening.
Hey, thank you. I have so many more questions, but we have only 8 minutes left. Can you tell us why Ghana has been sort of like a hub for when people, I'll give you one example, the ancestry.com or DNA, where people are able to tell where they're from. It's hard for people to track, okay, how do I even begin? But I know for a fact that Ghana is like a hub where people can start from if they're looking to connect with their roots. And so why is Ghana a hub? One question. My second question is, there were talks I had heard in several places where they were doubting the accuracy of the ancestry DNA. So as a historian, what do you think about that? How are they even able to track that this is where people are from? What DNA are they comparing it to if their ancestors are no longer there? Like, help us understand the back admin stuff of the ancestry DNA, how the accuracy is. So why is Ghana a hub? What's the accuracy of the ancestry DNA? And how does one begin to even figure out where they're from? How do you put all of that into one?
Great questions. Great questions. I think I would go back to history once again and give the reason why Ghana is now a hub of this kind of histories, and why people would have to go to Ghana to have that kind of content. And so when you go back, when the Europeans settled and wanted to transport slaves, they built forts and castles. And in Ghana, the Elmina Castle, built in 1482, was the first major European construction in tropical Africa. And so if you understand it, it means Ghana should be the point of contact if you want to trace all these kind of things. In the same way, so it was built in 1482. In the same way, they built the Cape Coast Castle in the 1600s. It was built as a fort, and later on, the British taking over from the Swedes, transformed or upgraded it into a major castle in the 1700s. And so it's one of the reasons, and basically why people would have to go there. And I'll show why. Aside these major castles, there were more than 10 forts along the coastal part of Ghana. So moving from the central part, western part, through to the Volta region, you would understand that the Europeans basically built a lot of forts. And these were forts and castles used to keep slaves, imprison them until they are transported across the Atlantic. So, for example, the Elmina and the Cape Coast castles served as a place for keeping slaves. And those slaves were not only slaves from Ghana. There were other slaves transported from the western part, like even Nigeria, Congo, Angola, to Elmina and Cape Coast to be transported to the Americas. And so when people say it's the hub, it's because it was the main point of contact for keeping slaves. And it also because the Europeans occupied the place and built these places to be able to keep them. So when people decide to go to Ghana first, and it's also because today Ghana is advertising and wants people in the diaspora to come back. And because if you trace history, you would understand a lot of people went through Ghana before they were transported. And so that is the point. When it comes to the idea of the accuracy of the ancestry DNA, whatever I say, anytime I meet people and I talk about some of these things, I say that, I mean, if you have the means, financial means to be able to trace where your ancestors came from, one, you have to read history to understand the movement across, basically. So if you have information, then you trace the history to be able to understand whether they came from the western part. If it was the western part, what specifically, where specifically. If it's the central part of Africa, where specifically. And then you can go ahead to look at this DNA. But I encourage people to, after getting the results of the DNA, I encourage people to go back to wherever these people were transported from. Because even if you're able to trace them, could it be that the person is your real relative, basically the relative you're looking for? At some point, people might think that they will have some percentage coming from maybe Nigeria, percentage coming from maybe Ghana and Mali. Then it becomes a problem. Where do I come from? Right? But sometimes they also go with the majority, where even if they look at where they will have the biggest percentage. So if we have Ghana, Mali, and probably Guinea or the Gambia in this case, the one with the highest percentage will mean that basically this is where I come from. But I also encourage people to also go to some of these places. There are people who tell histories of some of these things. And so if it's supposed that you have the highest percentage and it's linking you to Ghana, basically go to Ghana and like I had a conversation with you. I said it's very difficult for people to trace some of these, and especially upon going to Ghana, because Ghana is big. It's big.
Yeah.
And then getting people to understand is also. But then if you read history and understand that at this point in time, slaves were transported from this part of Ghana, this part of like the Chromantic case that I gave with Taki revolt, was because they traced the history to understand that this is where he came from. And so when you're able to trace it and you go to some of these places, there are people who are willing to receive you and probably tell you the stories and basically give you some of the elements within to identify if you're able to do that. So in getting the results, if you have the means, it will be good for you to go back and maybe get some of these histories to confirm some of these things. But I
Real
think
quick,
stories told by people also show that some of these results are legit. And I have an
okay.
experience with someone, a former colleague, who traced some of this and was able to get his basically her ancestry within this. And when he compared it with the history, was true.
Oh, okay. Okay. So there have been people who were able to find your people and
Yeah.
they did test or whatever they needed to do and found and realized that it was accurate.
Yeah.
You mentioned
Yeah.
that if you learned history and you knew where your people were transported or came from, you can sort of know where you're from. So quickly, can you give us an example? So, for example, if your people were held in Ghana, you said something about them going to Jamaica. What
Yeah.
about, let's say, if majority of your people were from the Gambia, example, or Nigeria, or eastern part of Africa? Sort of give us pinpoint some so people will know where to start from. I'm sure this
Yeah.
conversation doesn't end here. We'll probably likely
Yeah.
do an ancestry
Yeah.
one and give more
Yeah.
information, but can you guide us just to
Yeah,
have a
sure.
point of
I will,
starting?
yeah, that is a very good question. That is a very good thing to ask. I will later give a document on some of these places that Africans were transported. But then in the meantime, like I said, you see some Ghanaians being transported to Jamaica, some transported from Nigeria being transported to Jamaica. And you have places like Suriname. So Suriname, there's also a large Ghanaian community there because of this enslaved, the transportation of enslaved people. And you even have Guyana, where you can also see some people from West Central Africa. The other places in the Caribbean, basically, like I said, I'll provide a whole list. But then when it
Okay.
comes to um, um, the northern part of America, especially in the US, those people from the Congo, Angola were sent to Carolina, basically. Some were
Okay.
sent to Virginia, Maryland. Um, some people from western part of Africa were also sent to these places. And one of the things that come into play when we trace some of these things is the transportation of skills and knowledge from Africa. And so when you go to Carolina, and you trace some of this history, you understand that there was this large plantation of rice, and people from the Congo and Angola had the skills back home in Africa and were able to transport some of these things to Carolina. And so there's some kind of retention of knowledge, skills, and ideas. And there's a whole debate about whether Africans were able to transport some of these things. But the debate also demonstrates some kind of racism, because Africans basically in the Congo, Angola, had some of these skills and they planted rice. So the skills used in doing that even motivated the Portuguese to get these people, because we wanted skilled people. We wanted to produce rice. They have the skills here. Why can't we send them, right? So the connection is clear. So these are some of the places that they were sent to. I think I'll later give a clear document on some other places they were also transported to. Yeah.
Okay. So I have one last question, and then we can really quickly, 5 minutes, open the floor if anyone has any additional questions. So we can be mindful. We really want to be mindful of your time. We can bring you back again if people have more questions or want to dive deep.
Sure.
My question is, was Christianity
already
in Africa before they came? Because when you go to the castle where the slaves, the Omina Castle in Ghana, there's a place where a lot of the slaves were in there. It's like a small space holding everybody, and there was a church on top of it. They specifically built a church on top of it. And so while they're praying and doing all that, and the slaves are crying, and so was Christianity did it already exist in Ghana? And if not, or in Africa, if they brought it, how? Because I'm a Christian, sort of. So I was raised a Christian, but as I'm going through, research and everything, it has me thinking, what is the correlation between Christianity and slavery, and how does one begin to justify what happened?
For you to be able to justify, you have to know the context, and the context is very important. There was a clear connection with Christianity, and this is not fictional. It's I would say true fact. And I am not hesitating saying this. I'll give a clear example. So then Christianity existed in Africa before the coming of the Portuguese, but it existed only in Ethiopia, in the eastern part of Africa. So if you look at the location of Ethiopia, it is known as the Horn of Africa, because if you see the African map, on the Horn is where you can see Ethiopia. So it was opened to the other part of the world because it was also within the coast. And so it had some kind of contact with, I would say, with Christian
Europeans.
missionaries,
Right.
basically the Catholic. So they were complicit in this act. So there's some kind of, and it came even during the 4th century. You can imagine 4th century, as early as the 4th century, it goes way back. And they introduced this kind of Christianity because of international trade. Because at the time, Ethiopia had gold, it had ivory, and wanted to trade with the outside world. It wasn't slaves at the time. It was just basically natural resources. And in return, they also brought in some kind of clothes from the Arab world, iron, beads, and others to exchange with the gold and ivory. And so Christianity existed there. When you come to the west central part of Africa, it didn't exist until the coming of the Portuguese in the 1400s. And that is when it began. And their exploration at some point was the state exploration was even sponsored by the Catholic Church. So it went hand in hand, such a way that the people sponsored them, and for them to be able to control the minds of the people, they worked hand in hand with the Christian missionaries, because the Christian missionaries were evangelizing and then taming the minds of the people through Christianity. I was born a Christian, basically. So, but anytime I talk about some of these things, I mean, I feel okay because that is the truth. I believe in the truth and facts, and these are, I know facts are not sacrosanct, but I mean, these are facts that you can verify and all that. And so, they help in making sure that slavery was legitimized. So in some cases, the Catholic Church was ensuring that. When you go to the Elmina and Cape Coast, both castles, you see the church up there. And so they believed at the time that, yeah, it was legitimized in the Bible. People can have slaves if you have that means to be able to have one. But then what they did was to control their minds through indoctrination to make them believe that, oh, if you're a Christian, you shouldn't resist, right? You shouldn't resist against some of these things. And
This is God's
doing
plan.
that, yeah, God's plan. And I mean, you have to obey your masters. That was the key. Obey your masters. So even though they worshiped God, on whatever day they wanted to worship at the top, you see beneath that slaves were kept in the dungeons. And the dungeons where people were kept, like one dungeon would keep more than 200 slaves with all darkness, and they were cramped together and all kinds of I would say violence in there. Meanwhile, they were worshiping up there. And when you go to the castles, I mean, we've been there before. But then those who will be going to Ghana, it will be an interesting place to go. It will be an interesting time for you to understand, to connect this idea and to go through. And if you're able to understand some of these things and the dynamics, I think it's also a way to address the mental issues that we get after learning and understanding this kind of transportation of Africans across the Atlantic. And so, yeah, the Portuguese, not only the Portuguese, but also other European nations actually did that using the Catholic Church. They sponsored the whole thing. And when you go to Angola, when you go to the Congo, the Catholic Church sponsored the states to be able to do the damages in the over the period of slavery and the slave trade. Yeah, so it was, yeah.
Okay.
And it's true. Yeah.
We probably have a lot to unpack there as well when it comes to Christian, because I'm pretty sure a lot of Ghanaians are Christians. A lot of Black people are still Christian. It's sort of indoctrinated in us, and it's hard to, for me, it's hard to like, and it hits home for me because my family were missionaries, not back then time missionaries, but the past 20 years, my father, my mom, they went to Ghana to be missionaries. And so it's almost like, what kind of role, are we playing in this? But let me open the floor up. If anyone has any questions, you can do the raise hands, or you can just unmute yourself and ask questions. Oh, no questions?
Well, I will ask a question since nobody's jumping in. I just recently did a DNA test, and it came back that the majority of my people came from La Gambia. My grandfather is from Kingston on my mother's side, and my father's side, they were in the South. And so I really believe that I have a connection with Ghana because of my father's side of the family and my grandfather's side of the family, because Kingston, Jamaica, and as you said, there are many Ghanaians there. I also know that there's a community in Ghana called Jamaica. I think that's the name of it. And I'm going to go in December of next year because I'm totally captivated to find out about the history as much as I can. Because as a born American, we were not given any kind of information ever. I mean, I found out already as an adult that there were 10,000 slaves buried in the park in New York City, where it was used as a tourist attraction. And there was just a metal statue of a warrior there, but nobody ever told us, and we never knew that there were 10,000 bodies buried underneath that ground.
Wow.
And of course, now as I'm 70 years old and I'm hearing all of these histories and finding out the histories, it's very emotional for me. Last year I went to to South Africa. And as I told Naomi, just touching the ground with my feet just changed my whole soul. my whole soul changed just touching the
Yeah.
ground.
Yeah.
And then seeing how all of the buildings in South America on the main streets were the same buildings that were built in New Orleans, the same architects.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then realizing that the Africans built these buildings there in America as they built the White House in America
Yeah.
was built
Yeah.
by Blacks. So
Yeah.
I just wanted to say that, and I appreciate the information that you're giving. I hope that you have books, or you're writing books, or you will write a book, or something, because your information is 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 gold, and we have to pass this information on to like the children of Naomi and people like me, and we just need to know
Yeah.
these. We have the
Yeah.
right to know who we are, where
Yes,
we come from. You
Yeah.
yes.
know, so I'm very appreciative of tonight. Thank you, Naomi, and thank you so
Thank you.
much, Emmanuel. I just want
Thank
to
Yeah.
you,
say thank you.
Michelle. Thank
I
you.
think what you said is so true. Touching Africa gives you that connection. I mean, just touching. If you go to Ghana, basically, you would feel that connection, I tell you. Just touching
Yeah,
the
yeah.
lifestyle, everything, the food, everything, you just see it. So that is so true. We have countless of stories that people tell. People from the diaspora who go back to Africa, specifically Ghana, and see this kind of connection. Sometimes they don't see it in any part of Africa except probably in Ghana or places that they can connect. And so yeah, that is very true. So true. I appreciate that.
There is something in the air in Ghana. I cannot explain it. Every single time, I was born and raised there, but
Mm.
every single time that I get out of the plane and get off, there's this something just hits me, and I feel so emotional. I feel like I'm at home. My husband will tell
Yeah,
you, uh, before he got here and we were dating, he was in Ghana, so I used to go back all the time. I still go back all the time, but every single time that I'm leaving, I cry. And
yeah,
you ask yourself, why are you coming back to the US if you don't like it? It's not even asking
yeah.
as if I don't like it. There are America serves this opportunity. There are opportunities here that we don't have there. And for me, it's my goal, and I've worked towards this for the past, 5 to 10 years, where now I've seen the finish line, where next year my kids and I will move in there. I shared this with the group. We're building our house and everything, but it took a while to get there. Ghana doesn't have all the resources and the infrastructure that America has, and it has its wonderful things, but it also has cons, the same way
Yeah.
here. But
Yeah,
what I'm saying is, there's something in the air, and every time that I leave, before I get on the plane, I cry my eyes out. I don't know. There's this connection, and I just cannot wait for people to experience it. The healing that you're looking for, the connection
It's
that you're looking
amazing.
for, it's there.
yeah,
It's there. I
Yeah.
feel it every time that I go there. My advice all the time would be, because I've seen people do it a lot of other ways. If you can find a way to have an income in America and live there, you will be blessed. You will have the best life ever,
yeah,
ever in your entire
yeah,
life. But you cannot, because there are people that are saying they want to move there. I'm
yeah,
telling you, I'm going to be brutally honest with you. It's going to be hard for you, because their jobs are not paying as much as, it's, you can live, but it's the life that you're accustomed to in the US, it's not the same. And so if you want to continue with that kind of lifestyle, you sort of need to have some form of income here, or some sort of support here that will help you there. But we can get into that in a whole nother time. My first
yeah,
mission is to get you there. And then once you get
yeah,
there, we can talk about your journey after. What does that look like for you? But
yeah,
I just want
yeah,
to get you there first and help you transition, help you navigate whatever kind of life that you want to live. But I'm telling you, it is the most beautiful. Ghana and Africa. I'm looking forward to exploring a lot of African countries as well. But Ghana has something there. It is healing. It's peaceful. The music, the people, just being there is just healing. just being there. Emmanuel, when was the last time you went back home in Ghana? And what
So
was
I
your
went back
experience?
in the summer, last summer,
Mhm.
because my program is in such a way that I go back every summer. So I did, and I spent like 3 months there. And the day I
Okay.
was leaving, I was sad because I was going to miss a lot of things.
The day you were
And I
leaving
started
America,
missing
or
Ghana
the
the day I landed here.
the day you were leaving America, or the day you were leaving
No,
Ghana,
the
you were
day I was
sad?
leaving Ghana.
Okay.
When I was leaving,
Yeah.
when I was leaving last summer,
Yeah.
I think around 21st August this year, I
Yeah.
was sad because you will miss the community. I mean, the life here is solitude. You- I mean, it's always been like you're to yourself, but you have some kind of community back home.
Yeah.
And we all need a community, right?
Yeah.
We can live like we live in here.
Yeah.
So the
Yeah.
connection is there. The food, the people. Even in Ghana, if you don't have food to eat,
You
there
can
are
just
people
walk
who
to your
can help
neighbor's
you.
house. You can
Yes,
just walk.
without telling them, they'll give you food.
It's not even a conversation. You don't even
It's
you
not.
get there and they're like, here's food, eat. It's not a I told you guys my family were missionaries. My dad was, gone village to village all the time. I was pretty much left, not in a bad way, but like my community raised me. I would just walk to my neighbor's house and eat. There wasn't even a conversation as in feed me, or it was just, okay, today I'm going to this person's house. And it wasn't even, it wasn't it was just natural. And it's still there, where in the evening, let's say even up till now, when I'm in Ghana, when you're bored, you can just walk outside and there's somebody selling street food, and there's people, about 20 people just sitting, conversation, just talking. And then when you're tired, you go home and sleep. Whereas here, you can't even get anybody to talk to. It's just, anyway, yes.
Yeah.
All right, any questions?
But trust me, those going to Ghana and other part of Africa, you would see the connection, you would enjoy it. And I'll be happy to hear some of the stories when you're back. I mean, there are stories of people moving back to Ghana, building their houses, and then going to Ghana to stay, and then come back, and then back and forth and all that. Yeah, there are stories, especially with the coming of the year of return starting in 2019. There are a lot of people in the diaspora going back and setting up projects.
Yeah, and this has actually been the time to do it, because Ghana is developing, and so whoever the people that are setting up, projects or their businesses or their brands, they are sort of becoming the pioneers. So if, let's say, you build a mental health hospital or whatever, you now become the one and only, or the one who did it first, and will always have that whatever that's called. But it's a great time if you are looking into investments or business opportunities in Africa. This is the time to do it. But I feel like in the next 20, 30 years, it would be developed, maybe, I don't know. But in the next years to come, it's going to be fully developed like in America, and it's going to be hard to stand out as compared to, the competition will be really, it will be higher. But this was about the history of slavery. We will have we'll have business talks and everything. Let's get there first, experience it, and then when we come back, let me know what now we're back. What do you want from how do you want to connect to your home? Because it's your home, it's your birthright. As much as all of us, we were taken, or you were taken forcefully. Your people sold you, however you got here, you're here. But now you have people like me who are willing to connect you back there. People like me who let's just, it happened. Now what can we do? How can we go from there? All right. Does anyone have any questions before we go? 1, 2, 3, no, go, yay. Okay. So Emmanuel, thank you very much for your time. We truly appreciate you just giving us the background. It's nice to hear an unbiased opinion. I will be honest, I've in the past been ashamed to even touch the subject of what roles African had to do with it. I would just run away from that question because it was just hard for me to think that we would do something like that, but it's nice to hear the motivations behind it, everything that led to that part. We will definitely have you back. There's still more that we want to get into. We'll have you back one day. We appreciate your time. Thank you, everyone. If you want to find Emmanuel, he is on LinkedIn. That's where I found him, on LinkedIn. I'll link his information. If you reach out to him, say thank you for his time. Emmanuel, if you ever write a book, if you have a seminar, if you have a class, whatever you do, let us know. Our community is growing every day. We will always support you as much as we can. Okay. Ladies, thank you so much for your time and for being here. And we will see you again next time on our next class. The next class coming up is a Chi class. So we're going to learn the basics of Chi so that when you get to Ghana, you can negotiate. You know what I was telling you guys, that people, it's like always 3 times the price that they give you. You drop some Chi and they're like, oh, wait, they know what I'm talking about. And just find a way to be able to bond more deeper with the locals. So that's going to be our next class next month. We are going to bring Emmanuel on again when he has some time. But yeah, thank you all for your time. Have a wonderful evening and thank you. Bye.
I hope that our baby gets better soon, quickly.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Send prayers to my daughter.
I think we have the same name. I have to ask my friend from Ghana.
Okay. Yeah, that would be so dope.
I think we do.
Okay.
I have to remember.
Okay.
Good night, everyone, and thank you.
Good night.
Thank you again, Emmanuel. Good night.
Good night.
Bye, Kim.
Bye.